Good day, folks. Today I'm going to be talking a bit about, common topic, racism, of course, but really how individual racism and institutional racism are so intertwined, and how hard it is to really kind of break these two things apart. Even though a lot of times when we talk about racism, it's far too focused on the individual. Think implicit bias, which is effectively just unconscious racism. You acting out, or an individual acting out, um, racist actions, right? Subconsciously, or reinforcing the color line or racist status quo, or within the context of the United States, it's white supremacist status quo through your actions. It can be as something as simple as what we might call microaggressions in going up to a black woman and asking to touch her hair, which is quite aggressive. But what we mean by microaggressions is that individual level, right? Not necessarily small, slight things, but that micro level, that one-on-one. Macro is going to be at a larger societal level, right? Or larger actions, such as being more likely. Again, this is more micro, but calling the police on a black person that might seem like a suspect in something, or not giving a loan to a black person, or less likely giving a loan, which starts building into institutionalized racism and practices, right? So a lot of times, and as we think about this, particularly as the individual level, people um, have a hard time marrying these two things in a lot of different ways, and we'll get into that. What I gotta say is that really, even though it's about you, it's not necessarily about you, right? Particularly as we talk about institutional racism, or as we might broadly talk about white people, right? So, really, what we or I'm attempting to do here is kind of navigate through the forest and actually really take almost a 10,000 foot view and look at the forest, not just the trees, but the brooks, the wildlife and the different kinds of trees and the bushes, right? Um, and that's important is to one not lose the forest for the trees, but see the forest really for its entirety and the ecosystem of racial oppression, particularly within the United States, and how it manifests, and the multitude of different ways that it manifests. The best way to do that is really to try and understand our history and how these things came about. Then we can start really asking the right questions, particularly around one of my favorites is what does this actually mean? And really the intent is to get people to deep thinkly about what an institutional practice might mean, in both, really when it comes to how do we address that institution's practices of racism and how it perpetuates it, and how then it can help us arrive at how do we then address that to the answers, to building a better new society. Specifically, we're going to continually go back on focus on police and law enforcement, since it is front and center in these days. So really, much of U.S. history is the ending of one act of racial oppression, really only to replace it with another, while not attacking or failing to attack in full racist ideas and practices, or really the racist ideologies and practices. So really, this is the inability to evaluate and inability to see the need of revolutionary shifts, particularly within the U.S. government. This is a great failure, particularly of white liberals, which a lot of times will take a general reform approach where the U.S. is a general force for good, but just need to fiddle around the edges and things will end up being all right. That there isn't something fundamentally flawed within the United States and the institutions that grew up out of it. And even then, there's a different way to even think about the flawed. Is one perspective is that it's working exactly the way that it was intended to our founding, through much debate, and this is where we'll get on the and another topic of exactly why it is okay to judge our founding fathers by today's standards, particularly because there was so much debate amongst folks, and there were some stanch anti-slavery folks and even people we might dub anti-racist that were around at that time. So people very much knew that their practices were wrong, and even if they might have been subscribing to racist ideologies, particularly white supremacist ideologies, some of these folks really might have still believed slavery was wrong. Abraham Lincoln is actually a great example of this. We had a lot of anti-black philosophies in his head, and particularly still leading up to his death, his assassination, he still felt blacks were inferior to whites, even though he felt, there still should be equal protections of law, and slavery was convinced to emancipate, particularly by freedmen or free people that ended up being free slaves or formerly enslaved, and other black intellectuals and academics and activists at that point. He was pushed at to arrive at that point. And I really do want to make clear there's been no point in this country's history where black people have not been the central moving force to see full equity and application of the rights across color and even gender lines. We've been the central driving force in this country for a lot of that, for most, if not all of it. And I think we need to be really clear about that. So really, the crux of all this is that it becomes very easy to recognize institutional racism, the practice that these outcomes are racist. A great example, again, is in Madison can recognize educational disparities, arrest disparities, so on and so forth, without arriving at the conclusion that that institution is indeed racist. Now, you cannot have racist outcomes without a racist institution. If it was not a racist institution, you would not have racist outcomes. It goes far beyond an individual, because again, these institutions built by individuals through their practices, how they're set up to operate, was to have racist outcomes. It was built with racist intent. Our very funding systems and the way these things operate, even desegregation in a very real way, was racist. Black kids were brought into white schools as black schools that were already underfunded were destroyed, and those black teachers lost their jobs. And so, and white teachers kept their jobs. This was, at some points in some localities that would have been very much the intent. Other points that was the result, but partly of that and partly why it's a result, again, is that individual racists or buying into these racist ideologies, even if they might not be aware of them. Again, that intertwining of institutions and systems and individuals. And this is, in a lot of ways, where the idea or thought of being anti-racist falls into. It is not just enough to not be racist, to not subscribe to the ideology of racism, but you must actively work to be anti-racist both yourself as an individual, as well as deconstruct these institutions that are racist, and being aware of all of that. And a lot of that will have to mean, and particularly the best way to fight that individualized racism is to shift these institutions and to shift power into the hands of those that have been oppressed, to help to step away. There's some very real ways to do this. Locally within Madison, Wisconsin, the Senate 26 race, state Senate 26 race is the perfect example of this, where we have 2 white candidates and 3 candidates of color, 2 being black, right? And really the only argument that the white candidates have on any of the candidates of color is that they are more quote unquote experienced. And what we know is that experience is often used as an extra hurdle for black people and other people of color to get access to jobs and opportunities. And at every point, though, access to experience is hard to get. You have to fight 2, 3, 4 times as hard to even get that base experience and to get in the room to gain that experience. And then that experience is automatically looked as lesser in a lot of ways. That idea of a diversity hire, right? than their white counterparts. So the entire argument of experience in itself is based upon perpetuating and really individualized racist ideas and socially racist ideas. And so then the anti-racist action would be for these two white candidates to back out and then to mentor and to uplift those, to lend their experience that they got because, not all of it, but partly because of their own white privilege, this access that they were awarded that these other candidates were not awarded, right? So the best way to hear is if they feel that these candidates of color, and two being black and one being a black immigrant Muslim woman, are ideologically in line with them, and in fact, a lot of times stand for harder things or harder policies, better anti-racist policies than they are, then they would drop out, and then they would support and uplift and mentor and make sure that their experience is passed on to these folks. And then whoever the winner is, continue to back and support them and to lend their experience to them. That would be the anti-racist way. And in fact, it is very reminiscent to aspects of Reconstruction, where flooding. We had a lot of black people in elected office during Reconstruction, and as the South and northern white elites kind of created a compromise to maintain the Union, and Reconstruction, as Henry Louis Gates once dubbed it, was overthrown. Then you saw our elected or those that are elected office became vastly white all across the board, really up until recently, when we just started seeing more and more people of color engaged. So it's taken that same mentality of Reconstruction, which was an anti-racist action. And again, it didn't fall; it was overthrown, and to uplift these folks. And that is a very real way to be anti-racist, particularly within politics and the political realm. So, again, in thinking about these things and thinking about these institutions, some institutions might be able to be so-called reformed, or a better way to think of it is remodeled, gut it out, remodel it. Others might need to be torn down and rebuilt entirely. And think about it this way: chattel slavery, and in another cast, we'll talk about the very real difference between chattel slavery, historical slavery, which is different than what we know of chattel slavery, as well as indentured servitude. Historical slavery is actually much more in line with what we think of indentured servitude than chattel slavery. They are different, but they're much closer together than chattel slavery. Again, as we continue to think about this and these institutions that were built up, we know our police, our entire criminal justice system that arose out of kind of the Jim Crow South and even things leading up to the Jim Crow South, with black codes, vagrancy laws, segregated cities and neighborhoods all across the country, some by law, others just generally by practice, that still continues to this day, even though it is illegal, but that is not enforced. Again, systems and government, if it's enforced, we would be able to really attack these practices and institutions and not give power to individuals to act out their racism, right? And this is where a key thing is: racism is really more about power than individual bigotry. It is obviously aspects of looking at somebody lesser than within race, but you have to have the power to enact these things, which is a key part of racism. Stokely Carmichael once said, "If a man wants to lynch me, that's his problem. But if a man has the power to lynch me, that is my problem." Again, these things are questions more of power than of individual beliefs. So as you look at these things, it's all, again, about shifting power, removing power from both yourself as well as other people, whether they know it or not. Again, implicit bias versus explicit bias, unconscious racism versus conscious racism, or the true believers, and those that are actually on the side of justice. Again, this is not about black supremacy, but shifting these institutions and practices and moving things around. So again, we know that throughout U.S. history, police have initiated and participated with mobs, sat alibi, as racist violence occurred and still do. We've seen this actually very recently in Philadelphia, where the police there have deputized white mobs to help police protests for Black Lives, and basically just white gangs with bats. And that's very similar to how fugitive slave acts and the deputization of people across the country to search for fugitive slaves. You can really look at the rise of our prison industrial complex and the rise of our criminal justice system as a kind of a shift in that mindset. Again, making black people, maintaining a color line, or making black people subservient to white people. So as we think about police and we think about these institutions and what grew up, what has been created, police were explicitly created to maintain the color line as well as the economic line within the United States. But this again rose out of slave catchers. So the question needs to be really, again, what does that mean? Is this something that can be reformed, or does it need to be torn down and rebuilt anew? And even with that in mind, let's take a little bit of step back and think about that. And building something new is scary, and reimagining something that, or reimagining a world and taking away something that is scary. But police haven't been around forever. Capitalism hasn't even been around forever. These things are relatively new creations. Same with race and racism. Most of our history, most of human history around enforcing social contracts or laws, as we might think of them, there has not been a professionalized police force. Variety of different civilizations have not had a standing police force, yet we're still able to enforce these social contracts. Some better than others, some in very brutal ways, but the standing police force is absolutely a new thing, really the last 150 years, if you want to think about it. So a world without police is possible. We just have to be creative about it. A world without capitalism is possible. We have to be creative about it. These things are very, very real. But it wasn't just police, and this is where really that individual level comes into play, and why the need to be very intentional and anti-racist is here. So the Confederacy lost the war, but they won the quote-unquote peace. Their ideology of white supremacy lived on, specifically through the use of terror and mass violence to overthrow Reconstruction. Again, Reconstruction was very much an anti-racist practice. It wasn't perfect, and it wasn't perfectly at combating combating racist ideologies, right? But when Reconstruction was overthrown, racist ideology or really ideology of white nationalism, white supremacy, just exploded across the country in a variety of different forms. It was left to seep deeper and deeper and deeper into the air we breathe and how this country functions and operates at its deepest levels. Essentially, these northern whites, and I'm not using political parties on purpose, and we'll get to that not necessarily today, and again, to try to keep these things short. And another one about why it was less about political party and more about geography, being white and wealthy, and a lot of other things. But as this progressed, this gave way to rampant racism across America. It gave way to unfettered this ideology. There are no barriers in place. Think about is that you had organizations like the United Daughters of the Confederacy that spent years and years and years developing propaganda, spreading propaganda across the country about the inferiority of black people, of the Negro, right? And these things, these images seeped throughout the country, throughout our perceptions. Our media they had great influence on our media, and Birth of a Nation, this film, not the recent one, the old school one, which is shown in the White House by Woodrow Wilson, who was an avid racist, was sold out across the country, not just the South, across the country, and it gave a re-rise to the KKK, and it helped reignite a lot of racial violence and a lot of, again, these hangings, these mass lynchings, burnings and lootings across the country of race riots. And when I say race riots, I mean white mobs going to black neighborhoods, burning, killing, and looting. Tulsa and with Black Wall Street in 1921 might be the most famous version of this. But this was done in rich and poor neighborhoods alike. Again, it was just to maintain the color line and racial status quo. A lot of times in the North, police were used more in this aspect than white mobs to maintain the color line and to remind black people where they stood within this country. But other right wing organizations that grew out of the mold of the UDC, United Daughters of Confederacy, did very similar tactics as far as media and influencing textbooks and intentionally spreading propaganda. Most of the Confederacy monuments that we have in this country went up right around the time of the Civil War. Again, not Civil War, sorry, Civil Rights Movement, to maintain kind of this racial, to remind black people of their place in society. But think about our media and how racism perpetuates this out, right? So it's these most and then let's even think about this even further. Most white people don't have many black friends, don't have multiple black friends, and one black person typically serves as the one black friend for multiple white people. But you have to question: is that black person even your friend? You might call somebody black or another person of color, a brown person, your friend, and they might not call you your friend. So most in this country has always been extremely segregated, outside of very few points. And there's been very explicit action to create that divide, particularly between black workers and white workers, kind of that working class folks. Very intentional aspects to create and maintain that divide. Donald Trump is one of the most recent manifestations of this, but it is nothing new, whether it be through, again, the Fugitive Slave Act and other things. I mean, some of Jim Crow was initiated because there's a very real threat of a Third American People's Party particularly as agrarian at most, and started really in the South, of black and white farmers that were neighbors that started organizing together and became a very real political power in this country, very real political threat. And that's really when you started seeing the rise of segregation laws, and what we saw as Jim Crow. Mass violence and terror was already going on at that point. But they had to find a way to maintain particularly this economically oppressive system. So then you had to remind poor whites to jump on board. And this continues on to this day. So then with that segregation, all that people will learn about black people, brown people, Asian people, and so on and so forth, and the multitude of cultures that fall within those and cultural practices that fall within in these racial ethnic identities is on TV, is through media, which is owned by who, right? That will already, and they've already been seeped in these racist imageries, these racist perceptions, and so then they write black and brown people in media with racist imagery. One of the first examples of this is our minstrel shows, which were really at first white people dressing up as caricatures of or really stereotypes of black people, blackface, and that's really where that grew out from. And that were and like today, most white people didn't know really any other black people. And that's where they learn about, or so-called learn about, black culture. Again, and getting these perceptions, the way you view things, the way you behave. And it's amazing how a lot of ways that our systems even engage and operate black people, particularly with black people and black families today, is very similar. A lot of the same to how they started out, in the same language. Vagrancy laws, when they really first started, were used as an excuse to break up black families, where the government would go in and there'd be a black family that didn't have dutiful employment under a white person, particularly a white man, and so then somebody, a white person might recognize this, call in the authorities, and they would take the kids away, and then this wealthy white person would adopt the black kids. But they would effectively be servants to the family, if not worse. And that was really what we can really see as the start of Child Protective Services. Instead of finding ways to stabilize this black family in providing income, housing, healthcare, and education as a government should for all its citizens, it took away its black kids and broke apart black families. And these kinds of practices continue to today. Some of the same language, and as you go through some of these books, again, one of the quote-unquote 101 books, Stand from the Beginning, by, why do I always blank this out? I have it. Oh, yeah. Ibram Kendi. And you'll see this, or you pick up the book, The History of White People, History of White People, or The Half that Has Never Been Told, or any really book on Reconstruction, and you'll see the way that white folks and our narratives around our black populations haven't really changed that much to this day. And so this is why it becomes so important to be anti-racist, to act less about your individual self, because it is about you, right? But not to take it necessarily as an act of I'm a bad person per se. Again, that individualization of race and racism. But you have to start to act in an anti-racist way, to interrogate yourself, how you operate, and to make sure that you're working to break down these systems, these institutions, and to transfer power. And that's how you really need to operate and work. Other things are absolutely important, like what you might be able to call the de-confederalization of this country. You can say that the Confederacy lost and is a part of U.S. history, but how they won was becoming a part of the United States. The Confederacy is very much a part of the United States, so tearing down these symbols of the Confederacy are absolutely important. It has to be done to really move past and to have a truth and reconciliation as we need. Because the only reconciliation that happened was northern whites accepting southern whites back into the midst by letting racist ideologies run rampant across the United States. And that, again, that was done through terror and the use of violence. And so these things really have to happen at the same time. We have to deconstruct these symbols, these imageries of not just white supremacy, but of racism, and how it presents, particularly through media, to really change these narratives, as well as shifting this power. So as much as you need to interrogate yourself and your individual actions, and you need to do even more to shift these institutions and these powers at B. But even if you individually aren't racist and we don't shift these systems, we will still see racist outcomes. That's why shifting systems is so much more important than individualized racism. And you cannot undo intentionally racist practices and racist institutions with colorblind practices. You can close some of these disparities through colorblind practices, but they'll never be gone. You'll never get rid of racism. You have to be intent and focused about being anti-racist and tearing these things down. So really, if you believe you're on the side of justice, if you believe in Black Lives Matter, you will worry less about some individual actions of protesters, worry less about being called racist. Because if you truly are not racist, truly are even better anti-racist, it won't matter, will you? It's not about you. It's about those that are helping to propagate it, right? So when people say white people are racist, don't worry about that. Worry about being the white person that is being anti-racist, and do that work and do it well. And I know it gets tough, it gets tiring, but being black in this country is even more tiring. I've been trying to do this folks been trying to do this for 400 plus years, right? 400 years, and we're still here. And this work will take a long time, more than most realize, if we actually truly get started right away. But we have to get started right away. And a part of that can be a localized Truth and Reconciliation Commission. I really hope that that's something that we can do. But we really have to do to dismantle these institutions. So with that said, I'll end here today. And I'll take on some of these kind of topics that I dived into a bit, such as talk about, I'll dive a bit more into, why it's defund the police and focus specifically really on a criminal justice system. Other times I'll focus more on, other institutions such as the Senate. We'll talk more about the era of Reconstruction and the history of race violence in this nation, as well as the rise of very specific types of practices that happen, be it through redlining and real estate and some of these laws and some of these other institutions, and even diving deep into specific types of specific instances. So, maybe one on Tulsa, right? But I want to make sure to keep these short and digestible for folks, and not too deep. So, with that said, running a little long today, but I hope everybody has a good week. And if there's any questions or topics folks would like me to go on, we'll do that. Another one I'll go on is the myth of black on black crime. And I know a lot of white folks will get into that. And it is absolutely a myth, particularly since crime in of itself is one of opportunity, and being the most segregated we've been since 1968, and a nation that is generally segregated, you're gonna more likely commit crime with those that are around you. Most crime committed by white people is committed onto other white people, right? But we'll get into that another time. So have yourselves a good week, and bless you all, and wear a mask.